Hello, everybody. Welcome. Simon Rosenberg here from NDN. And we're going to just wait a few minutes as other folks, we used to say dial in, but as they join us into this important conversation. And so just hang tight and let's let others get on board here. We've already had a hand raised already. We're going to take questions. Here's the format for today. We're going to, our guest, Norm Ornstein, is going to speak for a little while. I'm going to ask him a few follow-up questions, and then we're going to open it up and have a robust conversation with the family here. And so you'll be able to get your questions in, and we'll be going to about 1:40. And for those of you who want to share this with others, the recording will be up on our site this afternoon. And so if you think it was compelling and you want to share with others, you'll be able to do it. Norm, let me do one more thing here. And okay, welcome everybody. We're going to begin. This is Simon Rosenberg from NDN, coming to you for the first time in one of these discussions from our actual office. It's great to be able to be back. You know, praise be to the vaccine and Joe Biden and everybody who's helped make this possible. It's great to be here today with you. I will also say that we're here on an auspicious day. It worked out that Norm Ornstein was able to join us on this day where we are debating the future of our democracy in the Senate. So there's a little bit of gravity on this event today. And I could think of no person I would rather be hearing from today than our guest, and Norm Ornstein, who I'm very grateful has taken the time to be with us. You know, we were aggressive about sending you out his bio, but just a couple quick things I'll say about him. As you know, he's an emeritus scholar at AEI. He's an author with the Atlantic magazine. He's been a commentator for the BBC and CBS. But I think most importantly for today, he's written very important books that I've read myself on Congress and how to fix it. And also he and his partner, Thomas Mann, were among the first people in Washington to start saying there may be something really wrong with the Republican Party and to really put the idea that one of our two parties was struggling on the table. And this was all the way back, right, Norm, in 2012, I think it was, almost 9 years ago. And so I think there's almost nobody who's more qualified, really, to talk about the events of the last few years, the struggle we're having with our democracy today, than our esteemed guest, Norm Ornstein. And Norm, let me turn it over to you, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this important day, and then we can turn it into a conversation.
Sure, Simon, thanks. So just a few things. It is an auspicious day, and of course, what's going to happen here is we are likely to get every single Republican who will vote to block even the motion to proceed, which is in a piece of legislation where you vote to move to debate before you actually vote on a bill. So very likely, right now, the For the People Act is going to go down before it even gets a vote on the bill itself. It will be simply a procedural vote. It's striking in a couple of ways. Of course, one of the things that many people, including Joe Manchin, have supported in the past is eliminating filibusters on motions to proceed. It's like having the two bites at the apple on a piece of legislation to take up an enormous amount of time. And it also means that people can escape responsibility for a vote because they're only voting on a procedural matter. That wouldn't be enough, however. This is not the end of the For the People Act, or at least it's not the end of the possibility of getting some federal election and voting reform through the House and Senate. I'm still very cautiously optimistic, although I'm more optimistic about Joe Manchin than I am about Kristen Sinema. I've had a sense over a significant period of time through conversations with Manchin, people close to him, that some of the things that have been interpreted about what he's written have not found the nuance in them that I believe is there, and that he made fairly clear in this taped conversation that The Intercept got when he was discussing mostly his efforts to get through the commission on January 6th with no labels. Manchin wants to push as much as he can to create every incentive that he can to bring Republicans along on important matters. It's a fool's errand. It's not going to happen. But he's made it fairly clear that while he will not vote to eliminate or weaken the filibuster, that very reasonable changes that one could argue, as I have, as Al Franken has along with me, would actually strengthen the filibuster, or restore it is a better way of saying it, return it to its purpose, which is that the minority is the one that feels the burden. Right now, it's all on the majority. We may get there after this. In his plea to the No Labels group, he, among other things, said, you know, my very dear and good friend Roy Blunt voted against this January 6th commission. He's retiring. Maybe some of you who will work with him in his next incarnation could convince him otherwise. Forget the fact that that was skirting very edge to the close of what you shouldn't be saying, to the edge of what you shouldn't be saying. His very dear and good friend Roy Blunt, when Manchin came out with his pared down but quite reasonable ideas on voting reform, designed to try and gain more Republican support as much as anything, Roy Blunt was one of the first to crap all over it. And then, of course, Blunt, after Stacey Abrams said, we can work with this, tried to redefine it as not Joe Manchin's idea, but Stacey Abrams' idea, which itself was a pretty shocking way to put things. But that ought to convince Manchin that this really is a fool's errand. Now, having said that, here's a couple of fundamental realities. One is we are, and I think it can't be sugar-coated, in an existential time for the fundamentals of our democracy. The laws that are being passed in states across the country, this is no longer just the South and Jim Crow. It's states like Iowa, Montana, that are designed not just to suppress votes, but to basically overturn the outcome of legitimate elections, are going to spread. We cannot count on the courts to protect us from these depredations. And if we don't do something, we could see 2022 be a catastrophe where the Republicans gain one or both houses of Congress. And at the same time, what they're trying to do in 2024, as much as anything, is keep the total electoral votes from a Democratic presidential candidate below 270, the margin needed for victory, so that they can send the election to the House, which votes by state. And even if they don't have a majority, they're likely to have a majority of states. So they're out to transform this process and turn us into a government that is far closer to what we would see in Hungary or Egypt or Turkey or Russia than what we see in places like Britain and Australia. And if we lose that, it's going to get much, much worse for all of us, particularly for people of color and poor people, but it's going to get worse for all of us. We need to change the process. We need not just the kinds of reforms that are a core part of the For the People Act. And I think much of what Manchin has put out there would be very, very helpful. But we also need this new bill that's being introduced by Raphael Warnock and others that would protect against the overturning of election results and letting partisan bodies intervene with local election officials and with the results themselves. And we're not going to do that unless we get filibuster reform. I'm open to several ways of doing this. My preference, as it has been with Al, is to flip the numbers from 60 required to end debate to 41 required to continue it, coupling that with a talking filibuster where they've got to be on the floor, 41 of them all the time. And I think that gives us a fighting chance of getting a lot of good things done. I'm perfectly happy if we move it to 55, but make it 55% of those present and voting. So again, the burden is on the minority. If 10 don't show up, they're the ones who lose. Remember that the filibuster on the January 6th commission, only 35 Republicans showed up. They only needed 2, or maybe even 1, because it's all on the majority to get to that 60 level. And if you switch to a present and voting standard, a tough majority leader, perhaps Chuck Schumer can emulate Mitch McConnell on this front, could make the lives of the minority miserable enough that you could ultimately prevail, and you get an enormous public focus, and they would be forced to defend over and over again why they want to blow up democracy. The Republican arguments in the case of the For the People Act are at the level of absurd. This is a federal takeover of elections. They're supposed to be up to the states. You would think that those who call themselves originalists when it comes to the Constitution would understand that it is flat out plain language in the Constitution that Congress has the power to regulate the time, manner, and place of federal elections. But of course, they're more than willing, and this is one of the shocking elements of this. Overwhelming majorities of them are willing to basically blow up all the norms of our elections just to give themselves the edge at winning where they have already lost. Finally, let me just say, as Simon said, Tom and I recognized a long time ago, really before 2012, that we were seeing a transformation of the Republican Party. We saw some of this in what we wrote in a book in 2006, The Broken Branch, the willingness to blow up norms, in this case to give an edge to then President George W. Bush. But by 2012, we saw that it was becoming a cult. It was a cult before Donald Trump. Donald Trump has transformed it into a almost the equivalent of a fanatical religious cult. And a lot of people, a lot of members of Congress, House and Senate, who in a deeper way understand how awful this is, are driven by what happens in a cult, that the fear of being shunned or excommunicated, including the physical fear that comes with it, governs their behavior. And it's a very odd, small number who are willing to defy that, but far too small. We are, again, at an existential moment. And if we can't find a way out of this, if we can't move past the sort of pie in the sky notions of Manchin, of all these Republicans willing to go along, showing him vividly, not just on January 6th, but on voting rights and guns, that they have no intention of going along with any of this. If we can't alter Kristen Sinema's completely, bizarrely unrealistic notion of where the filibuster came from or what her colleagues are up to, we're going to be in much bigger trouble than we have been up to now, and that's been plenty big trouble. So let me stop there, Simon.
Thanks, Norm. I think all of us are looking for the light at the end of the tunnel, the path forward. And in that regard, can you go over again your ideas about the reforming of the filibuster? They're obviously different from some of the things that have been more popularly discussed. And I think for a lot of people, this may be new. And I just want to give you a moment to be able to go over it again, if you don't mind.
Sure. The way the filibuster now works, from the reform or a change implemented in 1975, where the popular sort of discussion of it was that they actually made it easier to stop debate because they moved from 2/3 to 3/5. They actually went from a 2/3 of those present and voting to 3/5 of the entire Senate. Now that was a change that I don't think they quite understood at the time, but it was a profound one. Imagine if you have a 2/3 or a 3/5 present and voting standard, and 20 members don't show up. Say you're doing a round-the-clock session and it's the middle of the night and you have a vote and you only have 80 senators there, then 48, less than a majority, can actually bring about cloture and move to the vote, a majority vote on a particular bill. Making it 60 changes all of that. And, Al Franken had a good story that reflects this, where he was new in the Senate, very new. And on a Thursday afternoon, when they were going out of session, he saw a Republican senator and said, see you on Monday. And the Republican senator said, no, you won't. You have to be here. I don't. It's a cloture vote. Only the majority had the burden and the responsibility to be there. And if you didn't have 60, you were likely going to be screwed because you knew the minority had as its political strategy uniting against everything that you wanted to do. So it was at that point that I pitched this idea to turn the burden back on the minority. You know, in the old days where segregationists were on the floor and debating, and to be sure, they wanted to demonstrate to their own constituents, white constituency back in the South, that they were standing firm against voting rights and civil rights laws. But they also had to be there if they had these cots out and they were going in a session that went all night long and maybe round the clock for days on end. That no longer has to happen now. When it does, it's all symbolic because it wouldn't matter. The minority doesn't have to show up. So by switching it so that 41 have to be there at any time when they fall below the 41 standard, I'd make it 45 if I could, then they lose and you can move to a vote. And if, you think about senators who are mostly pretty soft, they want to be home or out campaigning or giving speeches. They leave on Thursday afternoon. They come back Monday afternoon. Force them to be around over the weekend. Force them to be in the Senate, sleeping on cots if you're going to have a vote at 3 or 4 in the morning. And that's not going to be something they want to do. Force them all to be on the floor debating round the clock, so that they can keep from getting to a vote. And you'll be able to prevail on most things. And it may take a while, and it may take some Senate time and floor time. But the other thing that it does as well, beyond these huge issues like voting rights or background checks on guns, or some of the things that we might want to do with social policy, beyond that, what Republicans have done with the filibuster that requires 60 votes is all you have to do is lift your little finger and say, I'm going to object. And you can spend days or weeks of precious floor time on minor matters. Even with confirmations now, they can take an enormous amount of time when the threshold is 50, because you still have to have a cloture vote and overcome it if they want to put a hold on an individual nominee. So we're trying to make it harder. And again, to get back to what I was saying, even just simply changing to a present and voting standard would alter the whole dynamic here. It forces them to be around. Now, I would say one other thing, Simon, which is what has really frustrated me and baffled me is, here we are now, 6 months into the Biden presidency. It's a 50-50 Senate. That could change even as we're speaking today. Somebody could die. Somebody could get hit by a bus. Somebody could come down with COVID and be on a ventilator for weeks at a time. There's an urgency to this. And why Chuck Schumer has not kept the Senate in session on those Fridays and Mondays, kept them around, why they haven't brought up earlier than this the Manchin Toomey gun bill, to show Joe Manchin that they have no intention of working with him on common sense issues where even there has been bipartisan cooperation. bringing up the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which he is ardent about, and where he has only one Republican co-sponsor, Lisa Murkowski, where with the last incarnation of the Voting Rights Act, the one that was blown up by the Shelby County decision, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Grassley, among others, were co-sponsors, and now they're ardently opposed. Make it clear as early as you possibly can that there's not going to be those bipartisan compromises, and then you can start to talk about reforms that you can argue to Manchin are restoring what the filibuster is supposed to be about, while you're actually really putting that burden on the minority. And I hope that we're now sort of moving into that period where they accelerate the pace, because God knows how long we have with any opportunity to get anything done, including judges and executive confirmations.
Norm, let me ask you one other question and then we'll open it up. I have been definitely in the camp that Democrats have had an obligation to talk about all this to the public, right? And that even going back to the summer of 2016, when we started getting a sense that Russia had begun to get involved in our election, that there's been a hesitancy and a reluctance, which to me has been explained in part because I was a senior advisor to the GCCC in the 2018 cycle. And I would listen to polling presentations saying, people really only want to talk about healthcare and the economy. They don't want to talk about all this other stuff. What's just your general sense about how responsible Democrats need to be talking about the existential crisis that we're in a way that is calibrated between being honest and truthful and being scary to people?
I think we have to be scary because it's a scary time. And, let's face it, we're not getting significant help from the broader mainstream media on this either. I will tell you that I think the reason that Mitch McConnell got his troops together to filibuster the January 6th commission after Republicans had gotten everything they'd asked for, and it ended up being a pretty weak commission, one that would not have a great ability to actually issue the subpoenas necessary to make things happen, where the Republican members, an even number, were going to be appointed by Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, but they still blocked it. And it's because McConnell recognizes that if there is a sharp public focus, and that would get a lot of attention, press coverage, television coverage, of how January 6th came about, of the role of Donald Trump, of what the White House did with manipulating the Defense Department to keep National Guard troops from getting there to protect the Capitol and the Capitol Police, with the role of many members of Congress in engineering all of this, that it would alter the public perception of the threat. Right now, most Americans don't focus daily on what's happening. And what Republicans have done is to try to distort the reality and take away the threat that represented by saying, yeah, it was like a normal tourist thing, or it was Antifa, or the FBI was engaged with it. They're trying to alter the entire landscape. And Democrats have, I think, a deep obligation to keep that from happening. At the same time, we're not getting the focus on these election laws that they deserve. And the fact that we came so close to losing everything, and we came close with the election itself, to be sure. I will tell you that I believe that if Georgia had in place the law that they have just passed before the 2020 election, that they would have forced Brad Raffensperger to overturn the results. And let's even say that Democrats didn't win the White House vote in Georgia by 16,000. That would mean 16 electoral votes going to Trump. That would mean the number went to 290 from 306. Pennsylvania, with its 20 electoral votes, I'm 100% convinced under those circumstances the Republican legislature would have put up an alternative slate of delegates so that the electoral votes would have been contested at the level of Congress. And then all it would have taken is one rogue elector. And most states do not have laws that automatically reverse the vote if an elector doesn't go along with what the state has required. There are others that have a penalty that's effectively a $1,000 fine, a misdemeanor fine, and many others have no penalty at all. Imagine the money that would have gone in to switch one of those electors. And then we would have seen very possibly a deadlock in Congress and the House deciding the election. We came way too close to losing in 2020, and they're trying to set it so that it'll be impossible to win no matter the margins in 2024. And if Democrats are not out there talking about this on a regular basis, it's going to be a problem. Now, I recognize, though, Simon, that we have a media that wants to make this both sides, and it's going to be a look at the frightening, scare tactics that Democrats are using. So, of course, we have to be a little bit cautious here. But we need to let people know, including all of those who are ready to vote and who might not necessarily vote in a midterm election in 2022, that we are at this existential moment. I think it's an absolute obligation.
And I will say that just one comment is that Jamie Harrison, the DNC chairman, has really been leaning into this conversation with his social media feed, with his public commentary, his going on television. It's a sea change for the DNC. And certainly it's great to see the party leader really understanding how important it is, the protector of our elections. I mean, in essence, the chairman of the DNC has to now take on the responsibility of being the one who's making sure the elections actually happen, right, properly. Jamie Harris and his team, I just want to commend them because I think he's doing a really good job in creating new language and space for a party that I think is still hesitant about how to play all this. I mean, I think that, and I could talk for a long time. And Norm, I'm just very grateful for the moral certainty in which you're coming to this. And certainly as somebody who's been out there, pretty exposed on these things for years, I'm worried about the courage, the collective courage that's going to be required to fully join this fight and see it through on the other end. And we're going to need people to step up, and it's really important that people like Jamie Harrison, you're starting to see more and more Democrats using up their public communication space, engaging in all this. It needs to be much more. There needs to be a much louder chorus, but I also am encouraged that we're starting to see some movement here. Let me
just say one more thing on this front, Simon. The White House has said it's going to do a summit on the threats to democracy worldwide. It's being run through the National Security Council. They're delayed in part, I am told, because they are trying to figure out which countries they want to call democracies and which ones are not. But I would love to see them do a summit on the threat to American democracy. Want to bring public attention to this, that's the way to do it. I'm perfectly happy now that the president has tasked Kamala Harris with the voting rights issue to have her chair it. Bring in a lot of people who can talk about what these laws are doing, about what the intentions were on January 6th, about who was involved and engaged with that, inside as well as outside. And the White House doesn't want to do this, I think, because they want to keep the public attention focused on their attacks on the COVID, on the accomplishments that they've made through the American Rescue Act and what they hope to do with infrastructure. But I think they're missing something very important here if they don't turn all of their public attention to this threat as well.
Agreed. Let me turn it over to our audience here. There are two ways to ask questions. All of you are Zoom veterans now. You can type a question into the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you. So have at it, folks. Norm put an awful lot on the table here for us to chew on. And let me, there are some questions in the Q&A box. So here's a good question, and that I think is always worth reviewing, Norm, and particularly from you, which is, where is the Republican Party headed in 2022 and 2024? Will we see a split into two parties, a Patriot Party and a more conventional center-right party? Will one wing of the party eclipse the other?
So right now, it doesn't look good. I will say that I think the only hope in the short and medium term to restore a kind of center-right party, or even a right party, because this is not a right-wing party anymore. It's a radical party. It's not a conservative party by any stretch. The only way is if they lose badly in 2022. And that's where these laws become a threat as well. If they lose 3 elections in a row, then I think there's traction for not just the never Trumpers, but the ones who are too cautious to even speak up now. And even among the Republican base voters, there are going to be some who are going to question the direction that they've taken. And that may have an impact on 2024 as well. Even with that, it's a steeply uphill battle, because if you look at the state legislatures, you look at the party officials out there, you've got a whole lot of people who are far more like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Louis Gohmert than like Liz Cheney. And more of them are on the way. This is their farm team. This is the next generation at this point of office holders and leaders of the party. And it takes us in a bizarrely radical, dangerous direction. There are people out there, mostly out of office, who are more reasonable, with whom we might disagree on many issues, but who understand the threat to democracy. I'm looking at, people like Michael Gerson or Jennifer Rubin, or now, refreshingly and unusually, Bill Kristol. We certainly have some of those. We have some former office holders who left Congress and who are appalled by what they see. Are there enough of them to turn that ship around? Not in the short run. But if they win either house in 2022, we're looking at a very long period of time before we see a responsible party. And we should all recognize that the country needs a responsible party on the other side, 2 responsible parties that respect the norms of governance, the norms of elections, and are focused on trying to find ways to improve the state of the country. What we have now is one cult that will bring the entire house down around them if they can preserve power. And we can't sustain that for any length of time. And even if we get past this and the demographic realities hit and Democrats move into a situation where they have a bigger majority overall, and it'll have to be a big one because there are, of course, these other broader structural impediments to having majorities prevail in the Senate, in the Electoral College, and so on, and with how they've stacked the court. But even with that, if it's one party that's dominating, that's not healthy in a democracy. So I'm hoping that we can find a different path, but boy, I can't be optimistic right now that it's going to be there in the next few years.
Well, and I want to make just 2 quick comments on what you just said, because I think this is really important. One is that on the thing that you raised earlier about Biden wanting to have this conversation about autocracy and democracy, but struggling to figure out how to make what's happening here in the US fit into that narrative. I mean, part of the whole post-World War II order was predicated on there being responsible center-right and center-left parties, right? And what you are seeing is a dissolution of that, not just here, but also in Europe. I mean, there's virtually no center-left left in Europe. That's, the Democratic Party is the only successful center-left party really in the developed world now, and over any period of time. And so I do think that this one-way norm at what you were trying to get at earlier is this notion of the stability of the party structures themselves as undergirding the autocracy-democracy fight, because you can't win the autocracy-democracy battle globally if we have a radicalization of all the European political parties. And I think this is an inevitable thing that Jake Sullivan and Biden is going to have to, look at, because it is a reality today in Europe where virtually every governing structure is liberal, center right, far right, and virtually nothing on the center left any longer, or what we consider to be the center left. The second point, anyway, let me go to questions. I could talk to you all day, so let me try to get other people in here. The second thing I do want to say is that I had a conversation with the major editor of one of the big papers this week about them needing to figure out how to describe the Republicans if they can't use the word conservative, and that the word conservative is really no longer something editorially that they can use, and to be a responsible journalist. And the way that I think the way we interchange liberal and progressive is also distortive of what's happening inside the center left, and that we need to rethink some of the ideological terminology in the way the Times and the Post and others cover politics. And to continue to use the word conservative is a conceit that we should be challenging, because to your point, we don't really have good language in American English to describe the ideological orientation of the Republican Party right now. And I think every time that we're we're not creating proper labeling, it's a gift and a win to them, because it diminishes the public perception of the radicalization that's taken place. And so I'm also happy to have you join me in that crusade, Norm, as we go forward.
It's been one I've been active in for a long time. There's this, I think we have two pathologies in our mainstream press. One is this fear of being attacked as having a liberal bias, and so they bend over backwards to assert blame on both sides equally. The both sidesism is a terrible problem that continues. And the second is the struggle, which I can kind of understand, but it's still going in the wrong direction, of taking abnormal behavior and trying to put it into a normal frame. So one of the things that I tweeted about yesterday, watching Rob Portman on television in multiple places, they continue to refer to people like Portman as moderates. There's nothing moderate about Rob Portman. There's nothing moderate about any of them anymore. You have a few who are conservative, but he's an apparatchik, and that's what most of them are now in a cult. And if you refer to people who are not conservative as conservative, and people who are not moderate at all as moderates, the signal you're sending to everybody is this is just business as usual with maybe a few little flares outside. And that's doing a great disservice, because it's not reporting reality.
I'm with you 100%, and you're going to see more from us in the coming days. Let me get to Morley Winograd. I think Morley is an old dear friend. I think you two may know each other. Morley,
of course.
Jump in here, Morley.
Well, Norm, I sent out a question because it requires a link. But I first of all, I totally agree with everything you're saying, as I almost always do. But second of all, if we are lucky enough, and it will require some luck, to survive the next couple of years of crisis here, I still think we're in for a long twilight struggle against the forces of autocracy in America. We wrote a piece for Brookings on the site, but Elaine's piece of the site, suggesting that we need to return to the how we won the Cold War. We defeated communism initially, we stalled it, is what we did. And it took 40 years for the wall to come down. And what we need to do now is stall the forces of autocracy with every ounce of our being and effort and resources and capability. But we need a similar strategy of containment going forward, where you draw a clear line on violence, you have an entire apparatus of education, entertainment, politics, government, and all aspects of society condemning violence. The Oklahoma bombing stories coming out now in anniversary time are a great way to do that, and the Post story today in particular. And then you just both have defensive and offensive activities from institutes and think tanks all the way to political campaigns in which you just draw the line between democracy and autocracy that seeks to impose its will by violence. I think that's the other thing that's missing from right now. God, there's so much to do right now. I'm not faulting anybody for not thinking about the long term, but that's why we put our long-term strategy to the website, and I enclosed a link in Q&A for everyone.
I couldn't agree more, Morley. And I do think this is a long, long struggle. It's going to be a long war. I'm very fearful of violence. I'm fearful of a reality that the vast majority of Republicans live in a world of unreality. The ones out in the country, 2/3 or more believe that Biden did not win the election. A sizable proportion think that violence is appropriate if your way of life is being threatened. The continued appeal on race, the divisive appeal in that way, laws like Texas is passing on guns, we're going to see violence. We're going to see more of it. And we have got to have a society-wide approach, just as you suggested, and an understanding that even if we manage to win the next election or two elections, that in no way ends the fundamental threat that we face. And of course, in many, many states, we're going to see a move even more in a radical direction. Arkansas, Texas, Florida, way too many of these states, Oklahoma, where it's crazy radical people who are taking over the entire political process. And, governors like Kristi Noem in South Dakota, who encourage so much of this. We have to look at this as a long-term problem, but we also have to do triage a lot of it right now.
Exactly.
Okay, Morley, thank you. And folks, I will post on my Twitter feed this afternoon a link to Morley's piece if you don't see it in the current chat box. Let me read Alex's question, and maybe this will be the last one, Norm. We've gone a little over time, and if you want to take this and then use this as a way to wrap up. Do you share the concern that Attorney General Garland has not been aggressive enough to head off or delay any of the state efforts to suppress votes, or let me add, to investigate some of the things that happened under Trump? I mean, what's your sense about Department of Justice's role so far?
So this is a tough one for me in some ways. I know Merrick Garland. He's a friend. I think the world of him. But I also believe that he came into this job thinking that his first task was to restore the morale and integrity of the Justice Department and return it to normalcy without recognizing two things. One is there are a lot of people there who are going to try and make the Trump Justice Department the new normal, and that's not appropriate. The second is a bigger dilemma, and to some degree I understand the dilemma. We have been through the most corrupt administration from top to bottom by far in the history of the country. It is hard to find a cabinet member who doesn't deserve serious legal scrutiny and certainly moral condemnation, from Wilbur Ross lying to Congress about the census to making $50 to $150 million personally while he served as Secretary of Commerce. And there is likely a lot of insider trading going on, to Steve Mnuchin building relationships and changing policy with people who he believes will be his clients now that he's out, to all of the dirty dealings done by Elaine Chao and Ben Carson and many others. And then you get to the White House with not just Trump, but Jared, Ivanka, some of the actions taken by Trump's children who were not in the White House itself, but we know are being investigated, Don Jr. And Eric, all the way through. And yet, if you go after all of these people as they should go after them, it is hard not to leave the impression that we are behaving like a banana republic and punishing our enemies once they've left office. So there's a balance that has to be struck here, and one where you have to give a lot of leeway to career professional people to do all of this. I don't think that Garland fully reflects the need to move to hold people accountable, and a realization that if we don't hold them accountable, next time it'll be that much worse. And already you're going to let people get away with something very close to murder. Now, when I will say, when they were discussing the commission on January 6th, I didn't want a congressional commission or a congressionally mandated commission, because I knew it would be too weak, that we're not going to get anywhere unless there's a really robust subpoena power that can go after phone records, documents, and the like, including from all of these actors, members of Congress, people in the White House who participated in this, people in the Defense Department, very possibly people in Homeland Security. And congressional subpoenas are just weak. They're not enforceable, and a Congress that hasn't taken the steps to enforce them. So I would rather, and I didn't want President Biden to create a commission because he's a party in all of this. It's an attempt to overthrow his election. But I thought the Attorney General could pick a special counsel and give that special counsel power, and let the special counsel, using career staff in the Justice Department with the subpoena power of the Justice Department, maybe even create a citizens group to report to evaluate, to act as a kind of surrogate commission in this front as well. There are creative ways of doing it, but I don't see any sign that they're moving in that direction. And I would say one hopeful sign was what Merrick Garland said about voting rights, increasing the budget, but also I think we have the right people in Kristen Clark and Gupta, Vanita Gupta, to move aggressively on those fronts. But whether they're going to go after the people who they should go after, I'm just not confident. And finally, let me say, I'm particularly dismayed by and angry at bar associations. The DC bar is pathetic. It quashed the appropriate investigation to disbar or certainly sanction Bill Barr, who has violated every standard of the law and sullied the law and the integrity of the process. And we've seen nothing done by bar associations to go after people like Rudy Giuliani. Now, will the Inspector General of the Justice Department finally do some of the work here? And that goes back to Giuliani's manipulation of the emails and of Comey in 2016, working in concert with some in the New York FBI. But to all of the efforts done here, we need Merrick Garland to step up, I believe, more than he has. And I don't know if we'll see it.
Closing thoughts here, Norm.
I think we've covered a lot of the waterfront here, and I'm, hoping, I'm certainly going to do what I can to try and move along reforms in the Senate so that we can get some basic protections in place. If we can't do that, we're in big trouble. I mean, the last thought I would give, Simon, is, one of the accomplishments that I had in the past was when I was writing a weekly column in Roll Call, was pointing out weeks before it happened that the Republicans were on a collision course with Jim Jeffords, and that they were, if they pushed too hard, they were going to force him to leave the party and they would lose their majority. And of course, that's just what happened. We have to remember that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, for all of their the frustration that they're bringing us now, we wouldn't have an American Rescue Act if it weren't for them. We wouldn't have the judges and executive officials who've been confirmed already if it weren't for them. And we don't want to get into a position where we have Ron Johnson leading investigations instead of, say, Dick Durbin or Sheldon Whitehouse. So we have to be a little careful here about how we handle the relationships and negotiations with Sinema and Manchin. But we also have to make it very clear to them that the stakes here could not be higher.
Norm, thank you. Just to, so many things I'd like to say. I'll just say this, that we all need to work very hard. I think that what is going to be really critical, I think, Norm, is for elected officials to continue to stake out more aggressive terrain, to give each other courage, to allow people to start to lead, to create space for others to follow. It's why some of the things that Biden does or doesn't do in the next few months is very important, because I think, I'm grateful for his autocracy, democracy frame. I'm grateful for this remarkable trip that he just took to Europe to start to put this all, the democratic system, the global liberal order back together again. But you're right. I mean, the piece that's missing from their formulation is how that all connects to what's happening here. And there comes a point where he's got to make some choices too. That's the president, about what he's going to do and how he's going to wage this battle. And because he can do more than the rest of us. And I hope that he increasingly finds his voice on this and start, it's great that he's put Vice President Harris in charge of some pieces of this, right? But he's created a rhetorical framework to get involved domestically on this. It's there, it's sitting there, but it's a global framework. And somehow he's got to create a through line between what's happening here and to his more traditional kind of way he's looking at the rest of the world. It feels very kind of post-World War II American global liberal order frame. And I think we've got to stitch it all together, right, to create this sense that we are now up against not just climate change, but we're up against the dissolution of the great American experiment, and that we can do something about it. We're not powerless, right? And I think that's the other piece that we need, is we need a few wins here. We need a few victories. We need some things that we can point to say, look, we got a shot at winning this thing, but you can't score if you don't shoot, you don't, whatever the line is, we need to get into the game a little bit harder, I think. And it's why I've been very lucky to have you. We've had Ari Berman on here. We've had Ruth Ben-Gayed. We've had a great group of thought leaders who are helping create language and words around an unprecedented moment in our history, where I think we still struggle in American English to really capture the reality of what we're actually living through. And so I'm grateful for your continued thought leadership and the fact that, despite having a few years under your belt, you're still fighting it out there for us, Norm. So keep working hard. Thanks, everybody. We've got a lot of great events coming up in the next few weeks. And the one thing I'll strongly recommend, on the thing that Norm talked about earlier, about how the two parties aren't the same, right? We are very different from one another. We have a whole presentation on that most Fridays, called With Democrats, Things Get Better. We're doing the latest one this Friday. If you like this conversation, I think you'll enjoy the thing we're doing Friday at 2:00 Eastern Time. Norm, good luck. Thanks, everybody. Take care.